Good evening. Welcome to this month's webinar, The Real Housewives of Pompeii, presented by the North American Cambridge Classics Project and Cambridge University Press. We would very much like to welcome Margaret-Anne Gillis as this evening's guest presenter. Margaret-Anne lives in Barrie, Ontario, a commuter community north of Toronto. She taught the Cambridge Latin course from 91 to 2016 at Barrie Central Collegiate, one of the oldest schools in Canada, until it closed its doors. Then she opened another Latin program at Innisdale Secondary School, where she taught Latin and Canadian history until she retired in 2022. She's taken courses for 10 summers to improve her artistic skills to augment the Roman life activities in her classes. She continues to supply, teach, and volunteer with the Classics Club at Innisdale, hosting semi-formal dances and helping with commencement. She travels frequently to Pompeii to indulge her mild obsession and has explored classical sites in England, Greece, and Turkey to learn about the classical world, which has inspired her since she very first opened her CLC booklet as a student more than 40 years ago. We are recording this webinar. We will post the link in a few days at cambridgelatin.org. And if you need a professional development certificate, please email us at training@cambridgelatin.org, and I will personally send you a certificate ASAP. And on that note, Margaret-Anne, the stage is yours for another fascinating topic about Pompeii.
That is so very, very kind. And it was where I live, it was -10 today, and we were greeted with another 4 inches of snow this morning. So, for all of you who are joining us from that area in the United States who have been hit by a Canadian winter, my heart goes out to you. But hopefully, in our discussion of Pompeii, we can bring some of the warmth and sunshine that visits that site so frequently. I am so honored always to be asked to do this. And I have to dedicate tonight's webinar actually to Pat Bell, because it was Pat Bell who sent me a message after last year's webinar saying, did you know that they're actually going to be doing a big exhibition in the Palaestra Grande on women? And I thought, well, would that actually be a good topic? And then you struggle, because what should I call it? And so I thought, well, if we're going to talk about women in Pompeii, and we only really ever talk about women who might be matronae, let's call it the Real Housewives and give it a little bit of some kind of flair, and maybe people will tune in and we can have a discussion. So please forgive me if I don't look at the chat, because I have rather a large amount of information to try and coalesce there. But I'm hoping that we'll have enough time at the end that we could maybe have a discussion about what you see, and you can ask me questions and we can go from there, if that's acceptable to everybody. So I will begin the slideshow, and we can look at the Real Housewives of Pompeii. So back in April, my friend Mary Beth, who lives in New York and is currently trying to shovel out her entire driveway at this moment, sent me a little snippet from a magazine. And she said, have you seen this? The Power Couple of Pompeii? And I said, I hadn't. So I did some digging. And this is the first tomb that we've seen unearthed in the latest digs that are going on at Pompeii. This is just outside the Sarno Gate. So at the end of the Via dell'Abbondanza is the Sarno Gate. And here you see a brand new tomb that dates to between 133 and 31. They think it's Republican era because of the costumes that you see this couple wearing. Now, we don't know who they are. They're unnamed. They haven't come across the inscription yet. Maybe because this is built out of the local Sarno stone, maybe it had actually been a fresco and the fresco had peeled off, or they haven't come across it at this point. But what's interesting is that this is a life-size, actually a super life-size couple, because the woman that you see here, and it appears more directly here on the left, she seems much, much taller. She's 5'8". And the man standing beside her, her husband, is 5'7". And I thought, oh, well, sometimes, wives are a little bit taller than their husbands. That happens. But maybe there is something else going on in this particular picture. And it's important because they want us to know, first of all, that he is a Roman citizen. He's wearing a toga. But it's her that we have to focus on. And that really, I think, is important here. They think that she might be a priestess of Ceres. And this is really cool. I hadn't really thought about this too much, but if you take a look right here in her hand, this is called an aspergillum. And it's a series of laurel leaves on the end of branches. And they think that it was used for wafting the aroma from incense on people who would be at some kind of religious event, probably here when they were worshiping Ceres. And I think it would be very similar to a First Nations smudging ceremony where they burn sage and then they use an eagle feather to do the same thing so that the participants are cleansed by the smoke from that. She's also wearing a very interesting necklace right here. This is the lunula. So little boys would wear a bulla when they were, very little to protect them from all sorts of evil things that could, end their lives early. Little girls would wear lunulae. And then when they were about to be married, they would take those off because that would be a part of their childhood. But we know in the case of priests, for instance, they would go back and they would wear the toga praetexta because it would have some kind of magical way of protecting them from bad things that might occur. So perhaps the lunula is part of that. And if she's a priestess, then she would need to be protected from bad things that could potentially harm her and therefore interrupt the worship of Ceres. There are 50 burials in this tomb. So they found the remains, or rather cremains, of 50 individuals in the 4 niches in the tomb. So there's more to come. As you can see, it's just a new burial, but that they've uncovered. So we'll have to keep our eye on this. But this is the first power couple that we're going to look at this evening. So from there, I had an opportunity to go to see this wonderful exhibit, and it's very elegant and it's very compact, as you can imagine. But it did, and raise some questions for me. So this is just from the landing page when you go to the site. And to find out information about what this particular exhibit was. And what struck me when I walked in was this statue. Because of the light and the way the light falls on her, you can tell that this is a woman who has lived a life. She's certainly a matrona. This is a funerary monument, so she's wearing, of course, that beautiful palla over top of her clothing. And I think the second thing that really struck me when I was standing in front of her is this. Her face looks exactly like the face of a picture of my great-grandmother that I had seen from about 100 years ago, because she looks like she has had to deal with some, even though she's of the upper classes, we can tell from her clothing that she's had to deal with some pretty heavy-duty items that have occurred in her world. When we go into the actual exhibit, there are, of course, what we would expect to see. We have makeup on this side over here. And what I didn't understand was that sometimes you used some pretty dangerous items when you were putting makeup on your face, most specifically lead, right? To keep your skin pale so that you look like you hadn't gone outside. But sometimes blush was actually made from the same material that they used when they painted their walls, that cinnabar. So that actually has mercury in it. It's mercuric sulfide, and it's very, very dangerous. Over here, one of the things that struck me were these keys, because she would have keys to important things in her house, not only the door to her house, but perhaps even the strong box. And in this case, there was a little tiny box that contained some glass bottles, which were extraordinarily well preserved. Down below, then, we see again another series of really fine little glass bottles that would have been used for things like makeup, perfume, and those little tiny tubes that you see were for collecting tears when they were crying for tears of the dead. And of course, then we have to have the jewelry. We have the very famous bracelet over here that gave its name to the House of the Golden Bracelet. We have these beautiful pearl earrings that are put together with the finest gold thread. We have some bone hairpins. We have some gold hairpins. This is an incredible piece of gold filigree with stones in it. And I kept this little fresco right here because it looked to me like that lady was looking with envy on that particular brooch. And I too look with envy on that brooch. But what really got me is this picture in the lower right. I know it's a little hard to see. I was really having a difficult time getting a picture of it through two layers of glass, but that actually is gold cloth. It's got put together by golden threads. And so it's a very small piece. It's only about this big, but I wondered like who could afford something like that? And how big was the item that this actual fragment came from? So I thought, oh my gosh, you have such wealth displayed here. And of course, you would expect to find that. These would be things that you would find in a tomb. These would be things that you found in a home, like Pompeii, where it was covered over at the last moment during the eruption of Vesuvius. What woman wouldn't want to have this amount of silver to put on her table? This could be put on any table today. It's in fantastic condition, and it would indicate the wealth and the prestige of your home. If you're a Roman matrona, one of the things you wanted to do is be able to represent your husband well. And then, of course, this stopped me in my tracks, I have to tell you, because right here, this actually is what's called a columella. And this one was taken from the tomb of Eumachia. And I'm going to come back to this. So I just want to raise this with you at this particular point in time. There are lots of columellae. We find them in tombs. They're put over top of an area where you bury ashes in the ground. And they talk about them being like this little anthropomorphic bust that you see in the stone. To my mind, it looks more like a swaddled child because frequently this is how the graves of children are marked. And over here on the left-hand side, the year before, there was an exhibit in the Palaestra Grande talking about the average person. And one of the things that struck me when I walked through that was the number of these little tombstones that were for children. And it's one of the things that points out to us exactly how fragile life actually is. We think that we live in a time of great prosperity and medical, interventions that can prolong life in glorious ways. But in the ancient world, that wasn't so. And why is this then included in an exhibition about women? Because in being a matrona, where you are to be, a person who represents your husband well, you look after the household, you raise the children. It is in that very thing that makes you a matrona that places your life at risk. And when I was there this past fall, the lecturer was saying that one of the things that was really striking was that they've come up with a statistic of about 30%. 30% of births ended in tragedy. Either the mother died, the child died, or both died. And remember that they didn't name their children until the 8th or the 9th day after their birth, depending on whether they were a boy or a girl, simply because they didn't know if the child was going to survive those first few days. And so that really brings home the importance of what mothers had to endure very frequently in order to be able to live up to that image of what a matrona will be. And I'm going to come back to this, so keep this in mind. Then when you turn the corner,
Margaret-Anne, can you go back to two slides back to that lower right-hand
of
corner,
course I can.
what looks like gold powder?
Gold, right there. Yeah, that's golden thread it's woven together. It's
Wow.
incredible. It's incredible. It's only about this big. It's very, very small. It must have been a swatch off something, but they were able to get that little bit left. Isn't that incredible?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Unbelievable.
All right. Thank you.
Not at all. And so here, on this side, we have a plaster. This is a funerary monument that we have. We don't know who that poor woman was, but we do know that that was tacked up on the outside of a tomb. And she has a box. And possibly in that would be the household accounts, representations of things that she would look after as a wife. And then here we have a fresco. This could be three ladies today sitting at Starbucks enjoying a coffee. We don't know. Or maybe it's the three graces. Again, we don't know. And then down here, this picture of the lady who was looking longingly at that brooch, is she a woman from a household, or is she some part of a larger artistic representation of a myth? Again, we don't know because the women on this side of the slide are anonymous. They possibly lived in Pompeii. They were possibly real women who lived in Pompeii, but they're anonymous. We don't know who they are. But the women on the right-hand side, this woman at the top right here is very well known. She's very notorious. This is none other than Emperor Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger. And
Mm.
below her is her daughter-in-law, Poppaea Sabina. So on the one hand, we have faces of women who could have lived in the city, contributed to the city life. We know nothing about them, but we know they were there. On the other hand, we know a lot about these two women. And so you have that juxtaposition of fame versus anonymity, which is kind of important in the city of Pompeii. And then I stopped here because this I thought was very interesting. It says plaque in relief with student and teacher, but it's actually a fresco. And it was found in a tomb on the Via Nuceria, so just outside of the Porta Nuceria, and it belonged to the Flavian family. So we know she was a Flavian, but we don't know her name. But we do know something very important about her, and that's that she wants us to know that she can read and write. But the figure behind her is identified as her teacher. And I looked as much as I could. I couldn't see anything that indicated why she would be the teacher. Could she be a younger sister? You know, if you have younger sisters, sometimes they're always at your back trying to do the things that you do in life. But I thought it was a very interesting way of describing this, which then led me to think of, and please bear with me as I go through this. It all has a reason for coming back in a circle. We have now this picture, which every single one of us has in our classroom. This is the very famous fresco of Terentius Neo and his wife. We know his name, we don't know hers, but we do know that both of them are literate. And they're actually neighbors of Caecilius because Caecilius lives right here, and then they live just across the street right over here in this insula in house number 6. So, did Caecilius know them? Did they bump into one another? Did they have dinner parties? It's kind of interesting to think about. Well, one of the things that's very important is that she can read and write. And does this mean then that this is a very commonplace skill for most women, or is this something that, would only be available to the very wealthiest? And what I find interesting is his picture too. He's wearing a toga. And his name is Neo, so we're thinking perhaps he's Greek. Has he just become a Roman citizen? And is the diploma in his hand, that which indicates that he's now a Roman citizen because he's been manumitted? Or is he holding the papyrus because he can actually read some things that are like history and poetry, and he's just that one step above her and he's more literate than she is? I don't know. I'm just posing that as a question for you. And then it brought me to these two pictures because we all know the picture on the left. We all call her Sappho. We know that she lived at the time of about the eruption of Vesuvius because of that beautiful little golden hairnet that you see. And you can see a replica of that when you go to Herculaneum and you go to the antiquarium. But right across on the same wall is a picture of this gentleman here. Now, again, he's holding also a diploma, just like Terentius Neo, sorry, and he has a laurel wreath. So is that because he won a poetry contest, or because he really likes the material that he would find from people who did win poetry contests, or that he likes Roman poets or what have you? We don't know. Are they married? Are they brother and sister? We don't know. But they're on the same wall. And what I found interesting about that is he's not looking at the person looking at him. He's looking at across the wall at the woman on this side. And she's looking at us. And what she wants us to know is she's literate. She can read and write. So now we've seen pictures of 3 people, 3 unknown women who have literacy. And so should we be thinking that literacy was perhaps a little bit more available to people? Or is it still only in the realm of the wealthy? They were found right here in the Insula Occidentalis, which falls along. This is the wall right here. The water was down here. So they were found right here in this particular building. And if you come out the front door and you follow this road, you go right through the Herculaneum Gate, and this leads you down this path right here toward Herculaneum. Over here would be the Villa of the Mysteries. This is the House of Diomedes. These houses in Regio 6 are the most aristocratic. They're the wealthiest houses. And so we know that people like to be close to their tombs. So this area of Pompeii is held for the most aristocratic, the wealthiest individuals to build their tombs. So keep that in mind as we go through. And then, of course, I threw this one in. I couldn't resist. In 2018, they had been doing some work in Regio 5, just behind Caecilius's house. So we have Caecilius's house over here in the middle. And then where you see that, yeah, that red arrow right here, we have a new house called the House of the Garden. And the reason why everybody stopped and focused on the House of the Garden, not only because just at the end of her street is this beautiful thermopolium, which is the thermopolium of the Nereid, this painted, gorgeous painted thermopolium, but her house is the one that actually has that little tiny, and it's like this big, it's very, very small, this carbonized writing that questions the date of the eruption of Vesuvius because that says that has the date of October. And therefore, could we have mistaken the eruption of Vesuvius occurring in August and it actually occurred in October? But when you go into the summer triclinium, which overlooks that beautiful garden, this is the face that greets you. And so the archaeologist that took us into the house said that he believes that this might actually be the owner of the home. And so when you start to look for images of women and places of women in Pompeii, they're much more obvious than we think of. And that leads me to Eumachia. So it doesn't matter which version of this textbook we are using, whether it's, the original single pages that we had in the first version, or if we're using number 6, like I have here. We have, in the newest version, 4 women who have been mentioned in stage 2. Julia Felix, Asalina, Eumachia, and Nivolea TK. And so what I thought, if you would just indulge me, is I would give you some extra information to add to these women. So when you're talking to your students about it, you can add that in. So let's start with Eumachia. And I did the order in a slightly different way for a couple of reasons. And really and truly, as many times as I've been to Pompeii, I never stopped to think about when people actually were in the city. And that's because when you go through and they say this house belonged to this person and this house belonged to that, and that's a thermoponium who belonged to this, you think that everybody passed away when the eruption occurred. But what we have to think about is that the history is in layers. And Eumachia is a very interesting example of this because Eumachia must have passed away long before the eruption of Vesuvius, and yet she's still very much in our mind because of what she did for the city of Pompeii. So one of the things that I wanted to point out to you was the fact that when you come into the city, you can actually only really access the forum from 4 different points. And so if you were coming in from the sea, you're coming in through the Marine Gate. And so you're literally coming in this road right here. If you can see my cursor, you're coming in right there. Here's the Basilica. This is the Temple of Apollo. Up here's the Capitolium. There's the Macellum. Over here, then, we have the Imperial Cult Center. Over here, we have the temple to the Genius of Augustus, which means that it must have been built prior to his death, because we know that after Julius Caesar had been declared a deus, he'd been declared a god after death, then Augustus kind of occupies this really interesting kind of place between being immortal and being an immortal. And so they would honor the spirit of Augustus, because it's not really appropriate to declare someone a god while they're still living, right? It's very anti-Roman. And then right beside that is the building of Eumachia. And this is one of the things that I just wanted to talk about very briefly. Nobody really knows what went on in the building of Eumachia. They think it's like a guild house. I've read some things where people said, no, this is where they actually process cloth, and I don't think it is. It's 67 by 40 meters. It is massive. It has a huge amount of real estate in the forum. And when you come into the forum from this gate right here, the first thing you see, it smacks you right in the face, is the entrance to Eumachia's building. And what really catches you is that right here, there is a colonnade directly in front of it. And this is what, for the first time, I never paid attention to it, but I did this time, and I'm going to take you through and tell you why. So we know she represents herself not as the wife of her husband, Marcus Numistrius Fronto, but as the daughter of Lucius Eumachius, who is a wealthy businessman. And she always refers to herself not as a wife, but as the daughter of her dad, which I find very, very interesting. And on the inscription of this building, she says that she built this for herself in honor of her son with her own money. And I'll take you through and show you that inscription. And there are two places where we find the inscription, because there are two places where you can actually have access to Eumachia's building. Of course, that monumental doorway that you see through that colonnade, and then, of course, from the Via dell'Abbondanza on the side, which is really kind of cool. We know that her husband became a duumvir because there's a small inscription to him just around the corner from this building. So he's about duumvir in the year 23. And we know that this building was probably built in the year 23. She was also honored by the statue, which you see here in the picture. This is actually a replica. The real one is in the National Museum, and it was put up to her by the Fulones, the people for whom she had built this building. And what's interesting about that is she is a public priestess. Very likely she was a priestess of the cult of Venus Pompeiana, because after Sulla had conquered Pompeii and made it a colonia, Venus becomes a very important element of the city. But what's very interesting is the fact that the building is dedicated to Concordia and Pietas Augusta, which means she's aligning herself with those elements that Augustus wanted to make sure that everyone lauded. And so here, this is what you see when you come in, and I apologize. It's so hard to get a clear picture because there's plexiglass in front of this. This is marble, and it's the doorpost that leads into her building, which is right here all the way around. And what I wanted to point out to you is this kind of stylized acanthus leaf that you see. And for those of you who've been to Rome, I think you know where I'm going to go with this particular slide, because right here, we should be thinking of the Ara Pacis, because this was that wonderful altar of Augustan peace that was put up to Augustus between 13, it was started in 13, and it was finished in 9 BCE. And it really talks about the wonder of the Roman people. It starts with, of course, Aeneas, the son of Venus, and Romulus and Remus, and then it links the imperial family, Augustus family, to the history which Julius Caesar had promoted as part of his personal propaganda. That's the top. Around the bottom is this wonderful stylized acanthus frieze, and I'm going to just show you a little close up. There you are. And so I wonder if Eumachia had ever been to Rome. I wonder if she just hired workmen who had been to Rome. But one of the things we have to think about is the spirit of Augustus in the city of Pompeii, because right beside this, here you can see, this is actually a statue of his wife Livia, which you will find in the antiquarium in Pompeii. So there's very close alignment then between all of those ideals of Augustus and the city of Pompeii as well. And what this represents on the part of Eumachia is the term euergetism, which is doing good works on behalf of the people of the city in which you live, right? So you want to do these things out of an altruistic reason. You're going to let people know that you did it, but you're still donating on your own to benefit the people where you live. And so for the first time, I actually stopped and paid attention to the bits of marble that you find in the forum. And so some are up, they've been restored at the top of the arcade, and some are still down. But oh my goodness, Look, there it is. There's Ministris Fronto. There's the Calicidicum, and that is really just the colonnade because it had been made of marble. And over here is Concordiae Augustae. So, in fact, this inscription, which I'm going to show you in a minute, was actually also on top of the arcade. So, when you were in the forum and you were looking at that covered colonnade all the way around, all you could see would be that monumental frieze that had been carved in behalf of Eumachia. This is where she actually talked about who she was and why she built this particular building. I apologize again for my picture. My wide angle lens wasn't as wide angle as I needed it to be able to take this picture. But I'm standing just inside the doorway on the grassy area right now that looks across. It's such a huge building. I can't even begin to tell you how huge it is. There's an apse right here, and there's a platform. Probably there was a statue of Concordia right there. And behind it, behind that wall, is where you'll find the statue of Eumachia. There were walls right here with windows that looked into this central courtyard. And so this part must have been the part all the way around that had been covered with a roof. So you can come in through the front doors. You can also come in through the side door, and I'm going to show you that. Now, to take this picture, which is looking back over here to the monumental doorway, I'm standing about here taking a picture of this wall. It's quite a wide space. It would have accommodated a large number of people to stand inside. But this is really what I wanted to point out to you. If you take a look at this, you see that there are two layers to the stonework that runs around the outside. If this is open to the sky, then this must be a massive impluvium. And they did find evidence of a cistern attached to this. So perhaps this was like a giant reflecting pool that just had light go all the way through. And that's one of the reasons why you had those windows, because that light then would reflect into the hallways behind. And maybe it's not because this is where they process cloth, but maybe this is where the cloth sellers come actually to sell their cloth. We know that Munistrius, Eumachia's husband, had a huge amount of land in the Apennine Mountains, and he had a lot of sheep. And maybe this is how she got involved with the cloth makers in the first place, is this is a place where they came to sell their wool and cloth so that they could manufacture it within the city. And you're not going to take all of your wares in through a monumental doorway like that. You're going to bring it up a back staircase from, of course, the Via dell'Abbondanza. And that's what you see right here, this back staircase. It must have been like a ramp that had kind of stairs in it to make it so that you could climb up. And here we are from the Via dell'Abbondanza looking back in. There's actually a water fountain right at the bottom. So if that actually was a cistern, then it could take the water down toward this water fountain. And here you see there is the second of the friezes that talks about Eumachia and why she built this. And one of the things that I wanted to point out, it wasn't just that she built the colonnades. So she built the building, the covered colonnade, the color portico, the colonnade. It wasn't just that she built it for herself. She built it for her son to give him a leg up in politics. And she built it not just at her own expense, but it says sua pecunia, with her own money. And she dedicated it to the moral values of Concordia and Pietas. And that's very important because that tells you about who she is. But what's interesting is you don't really see a mention of her husband. She did this on her own. She is a woman who can act on her own. So here's her tomb. And where's her tomb? Okay, her tomb is just outside the Nucarian Gate on the Nucarian Road. In actual fact, it's halfway down. So when you're walking along, you can see it. It's 14 meters by 14 meters. It's absolutely massive. And it is said to have had a frieze along the front of it that told the story of the Amazons, which I think is so appropriate if you think of Eumachia from that perspective. What was interesting is that there were 13 of those little columella found inside. So if you see the little grate at the bottom, that's where you go in, and there's a little area of land, and the columella were actually found inside there. There were 4 inscribed that they found. Some didn't have any names on them. One was to Lucius Eumachius Aprilius, who died at the age of 20. So she must have had a second son. Maybe he, was, outlived the other. We don't exactly know. But one of them was actually dedicated to the mother of Gnaeus Allius Nigidius Maius. He has a big house in Pompeii, and he has a tomb that's in the other direction outside the Stabian Gate. So why his mom was in this tomb is really unusual. Were they related in some way? Or perhaps Eumachia, who identifies herself again on her tomb that she built as the daughter of Lucius, and she built it sibi suis for herself and for her family. So perhaps by the time we have the eruption of Vesuvius, her tomb had fallen into disrepair because maybe her family members had passed away and therefore weren't there to take care of it. Whatever the case, here we have then a monument where she talks about how strong she is. And I wonder, and I just throw this out there for you to consider, could Eumachia's donation on behalf of her son have influenced Papidius the baker to pay for the refurbishment of the Temple of Isis, which is right here, to give his son a leg up in politics later on, which sadly we know wouldn't happen as a result of the events of 79. And then we come to Julia Felix. Now, she is really cool. She doesn't have a casa. She doesn't have a domus like Caecilius. She doesn't have a villa like the Vetii. She has a praedia. She actually has a massive estate. And she was able to use her influence to have a road move so that she has an actual city block. She has several, not only does she have her house and a private bath complex, but she also has several businesses within this, which is very interesting. Here is the front door to her house. It was first excavated in 1755, and then it was reburied, and then they've done excavations ever since. And what's one of the interesting things about that is you can see her front door, but you see right here on the right-hand side, there is a shop that opens into her house, which means that she probably, whoever lived in that house, her, she was probably actively engaged in whatever business went on there in addition to it. And then if you look at this picture, I've kind of tried to give you a sense of either side. Down this little, what they call the Vicolo Julia Felice now, there are a few shops that you could access here. And then on the other side of her front door is this. This is the bath complex, and it looks like she actually allowed people to have access to her private bath complex, probably for those people who were very well heeled and had lots of money, because as we know, after the events of 62, 63 with the earthquake, some of the baths weren't working as well as they could have, and so she opened that to them. This was on display in the exhibition, and it talks a little bit about Julia Felice. Julia Felix. She was the daughter of Spurius. Being endowed with a far-sighted economic vision, she was actually a very savvy businesswoman. And we know from her name, Julia, that she probably was part of the Julio-Claudian clan because she has the name Julia. Was she related to Julius Polybius, who lived just down the road? We don't know. Probably related to him in some way. She might have descended actually from some liberty of Augustus. But one of the things that Sophie Hay, and we all know who Sophie Hay is because she's the talking head in stage 12 in our book. There she is right there. Sophie Hay was actually interviewed by this lady, Elodia Harris, because she writes some historical novels. And Sophie Hay has done a lot of research on Julia Felix, and she suggests that spurious means that Julia Felix didn't actually have a dad. She was one of those women who had the unfortunate reality of not having anyone specific to look after her. If you are illegitimate and you don't have a dad to help you in life, and particularly arrange a good marriage for you, what do you do? And she's gone on to be extraordinarily business savvy. She doesn't need a man in her life. Was she married? We have absolutely no idea. But one of the things that they point out here in the exhibition is that she rented out her house. She rents a luxurious bath worthy of Venus, shops with mezzanine floors, dining rooms on the upper floor from the 1st of August until this date recurs for the 6th time. So for 5 consecutive years. And if you don't say that you don't want to rent it, she continues that you are going to rent it. She also makes not only money from this and from the bathhouse, but from all of the businesses that she has on the side. So she's very, very smart. Here is her house when you look down this arcade. So when you come in the front door, there's one impluvium right here. And then you walk down this arcade, which is right here with the most beautiful colonnade I've ever seen of these little square rectangular columns, right? And as you walk along, everything faces out onto this monumental garden. And the reason she did that was she wanted to bring the country into the city. So she has a wall that goes all the way around her house. So while she has four roads and she's on a very, very busy road, the Via dell'Abbondanza, behind her is the amphitheater. You've got the Palaestra, all of these businesses. She has serenity in the center of the city. There, when you get to the very end of that colonnade, there is the little private house with the kitchen over on this side. And there are windows that face out onto the garden. So she's really been trying to capture the essence of bringing the country in, otium, into her house. And there's just a sample of what the garden would have looked like. Here, if you look at this picture right here, the only time I've ever seen a dining room like this is at Tivoli in Hadrian's house, because at the back of his canopus, he has a dining room which is very much like this. At the back where you see those stairs, that's actually where water would cascade down. It would be very cooling for the people having their dinner sitting there. And then the water would drain away and go down into the garden. And here what you can see is like a river in the middle of all of this, right? This beautiful water feature with all of these plants around. And then outside of that, there were fruit trees all through the rest of the garden in front of the wall. And here we have the bath complex. It would have been loud because a bath complex is naturally loud. We know that. And the windows from the bath complex face out onto this garden. So while you're having your bath, you're also meant to be able to enjoy the surrounding area. And it was sumptuous. This bath, I've only been in once, but this bath was very highly decorated in cinnabar, which we know is 45 times the cost of white paint. And also, if you look, you have that beautiful lapis lazuli blue. And then if you take a look here, there's her biggest neighbor, the amphitheater. But she has these windows that look out onto the garden, and she's shielded from a lot of the noise because of this high wall. So, why else is she important to us? Because she has a lot of artwork, which you will find in the National Museum. And when I was there a couple of years ago, they had taken some of what they call the pedestrian artwork and they had put it out on display. And so when you see these pictures, you get a sense of what life in Pompeii was like for the average individual. Julia Felix is not someone of the upper class. She's just a regular individual who happened to make good on her money. And what's interesting is Sophie Hayes says that in 1950, when they were excavating her house, they actually came across a skeleton in the ground and that was wearing a lot of beautiful jewelry. And as a result of that, one of them pieces of jewelry was this beautiful ring that had a picture of Mercury in it. And so people kind of romanticized, could this possibly be Julia Felix who was trying to escape as Vesuvius was destroying her property? We don't know. But one of the things we do know is she's like us and she had an opportunity to do well, even though she came from some fairly challenging childhood issues. And then, of course, we have Asalina, who has a wonderful Calpona, Popina, Thermopolium. It's in the middle of the Via dell'Abbondanza. It's very small. It was excavated in 1911 to 1913. These pictures come from 1913. But we know that this belonged to Asalina because her name's on the inside of the shop. She had three barmaids, Igle, who is Greek, Zimirina, who happened to be from Syria, and Maria, who was from Judea. They all lived, it seemed, in this house. They certainly were her assistants or her barmaids, or maybe they co-owned this shop with her. But what's very, very important is the fact that they had political graffiti which names them on either side of the opening of the doorway. And that's important because they must have had a fair bit of money. They were able to paint the exterior with that cinnabar color. They were able to pay a sign painter who was able to come in and paint the political graffiti. And they must have felt safe enough to be able to put that up and not worry about some of the, the difficulties that would come during an election time. They're in the middle of the street, so though their shop is relatively small, don't forget there were about 90, possibly more thermopolia in the city. They were probably able to do a fairly brisk business because they have all of these beautiful little items inside that house. So these are fairly high quality that you would see in just an average thermopolium. There's a picture of it. You can see right here to the right. They are a neighbor of the Villa of the Castiamonti. And of course, there's some suggestion that because it's so small, how did these women make their money? Well, perhaps they made it through other interests. And I'm going to suggest that that staircase that you see here, which is to the left of the serving counter, is really where they access their home above, because it's not unusual for people to live above their shops so that they can keep an eye on things. On the right-hand side, you can see that Asalina and Zimarina support Lollius, but on the left, the two other people who are in the shop, Maria and Igle, support Gnaeus Helvius Sabinus, because the Sabini family, Poppaea Sabina's family, were an important family in the city of Pompeii. And it's interesting because they're supporting two rival candidates in the election. So it might be that they were engaged in a lot of political discussion, but the fact is that they could have that political discussion. And here's my favorite. Naivoleatike. She's my favorite of all of the four women. Why? She's a Liberta. She marries an Libertus Gaius Munatius Faustus. He goes on to make good. He's an Augustales, and he's a city official. She's known as the woman with two tombs because she has a tomb not only in the via leading to Herculaneum, but also in the via leading to Nuceria. And she builds this very ornate very ornate tomb here in honor of her husband. But she actually sets it up so that this can be the tomb for her freedmen and the freedmen of her husband. She builds it in honor of him. And so there you can see her. There is Naivoleatike. And so again, did she decorate this tomb in honor of what she saw on behalf of Eumachia doing good things for the city? Did she do this? Is this a recollection of what Eumachia had done? Or is this, just something to show that she has a lot of wealth? Her husband, she made money through shipping for the most part. And so one of the things that she wants us to pay attention to is the fact that her husband, who was an Augustales and also a suburban official, had been given a plot of land for his services, and he was granted a double seat, so presumably for her and him to share when they went out publicly to either the theater or the amphitheater. But this is something that she's done for her freed slaves. So she was herself a former enslaved woman and has gone on to do something very nice for her freed slaves. She seems, however, to be buried right here. I find this very interesting because it's a duplex for a tomb. This was actually given to Munatius Faustus by the Decuriones for works that he had done on behalf of the city. And so we see here that she actually is living up to that name of Matrona. And her family is buried in here. But this is what this is what I really wanted to point out to you, is that inside they found a series of these columelle. And so although she and her husband are buried here, I wanted to just ask you a question because, again, I'm not exactly sure, but one of these columelle recalls the name, it's this one down here, Lucius Naivoleus Eutrapellus. Could that have been her former master, or was she married to her former master and had a son by him, which would have carried the former master's name, and then she married her husband as a second husband? Or is this her former master and she's taken him in and buried him with them? But one of the things that I want to point out is that buried in here are Munatia UK, clearly their daughter, Helpus, who died at the age of 3, Primigenia, who died at the age of 9 months, 5 days, Arsinoe, who died at the age of 3, Psyche, who died at the age of 3 and 4 months, and then Gaius Munatius Atimatus, who died at the age of 26. So as much as she and her husband benefited and they were very kind to their freedmen, obviously they made an awful lot of money to be able to put a tomb in the most expensive area of the city for their freedmen. She also lost children, and that has to be the hardest thing for a parent to do. You can have all the money in the world, but if you can't save your child, what is the purpose of having that, right? And so clearly she's gone on to do good things despite tragedy that she's faced in her life. And so when I was in Pompeii, I was lucky enough to be there on the first time that they've ever opened up the city to allow reenactors, gladiators, soldiers, people who made bread, people who made food, a fellow who made shoes, another fellow who was making coins. People were walking through the city dressed as Romans. They came from all over Europe for 2 days to populate the city of Pompeii. And I thought I was going to lose my mind. I'd actually just come down from the Castiamonte house, and I'm actually standing in front of Julius Polybius' house. It's right here. And all of a sudden, it's like one of those frescoes from the house of Julia Felix came alive. And all these people were in the street. And I thought, I was transported back. And so this is what I want to leave you with. Here were three women who walked right by me dressed as Roman women. And I wondered if that could have been Nivolea, Asalina, and Julia Felix at some point in the history of Pompeii. Did they ever meet? Did they ever talk? And did they ever have a conversation about the good things that they could do? Because although they might not necessarily have always followed the path of what a Matrona was, they were people who had contributed to the extraordinary success of Pompeii. So, I want to thank you so much for your very, very kind attention this evening. I'm happy to take as many questions as you have or just have a conversation about these women. Again, I just throw this out there. I'm not a scholar by any means, and I haven't had an opportunity to do a deep dive into any of these, but I was hoping that maybe it might add some information that you could share with your kids when you're taking them through the Roman life sections of the book. So thank you. Thank you very much. There you go.
Oh my goodness, Margaret Ann, you truly are a Pompeian expert.
Oh,
For those of you who are new to Margaret Ann's webinars, she has been to Pompeii 72 times. So I think that in itself is quite remarkable. And you truly are an expert on all things Pompeii.
thank
And
you.
I
That's
hope
very
that
kind.
everyone has found this enlightening, helpful, and as she said, hopefully you can take many of these things that she shared with you back to your students. And on
Thank
that note,
you.
I'm going to stop the recording,
Of
but I am
course.
going to allow each of you to unmute yourselves and feel free to ask her any questions that you might have.